So Jenna Ben-Yehuda is our speaker tonight. We invited her to come to Chapel Hill to share her insights on NATO at 75 and the future of the transatlantic transatlantic alliance. Jenna's first job in Washington was to work on the 50th anniversary summit for NATO. 25 years later, she's had an amazing career. At the State Department, Jenna served in a range of intelligence and policy roles in the Western Hemisphere, including as Senior Military Advisor to U.S. Northern Command, U.S. Southern Command, and U.S. Special Operations Command. That's a lot, Jenna. And she's also worked in the private sector and as former president and chief executive officer of the Truman National Security Project and the Truman Center for National Policy. She's now the executive vice president at the Atlantic Council, where she helped organize last year's NATO Summit Public Forum, which I got to participate in. We both were at the State Department at a time when the doors and much of the building had a sign on them, which reminded us what we were working on. It was a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Somehow I think about those and they give me like great comfort. They seem to be the sort of thing to have the State Department focused on the well-being of Europe. It feels far away today, and also I think it was some of the most remarkable and meaningful work I ever got to do.
75 years ago, in the aftermath of World War II, 12 nations came together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO.
If there is anything inevitable in the future, it is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
Signed on April 4, 1949 in Washington, D.C., the North Atlantic Treaty was a historic commitment to ensure peace and prosperity through a community united by democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. The original members pledged that an armed attack against one or more of them would be considered an attack against them all. 12 years later, at one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, the Atlantic Council was founded to advance the mission of NATO. It was a mission grounded in the transatlantic community, but extending beyond it, devoted to providing collective security and practical solutions to the world's most pressing problems. Throughout the Cold War, NATO served as a critical bulwark against Soviet expansion, conducting joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, and strategic planning. The alliance helped maintain a fragile peace in Europe and provided a platform for transatlantic cooperation. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and collapse of the Soviet Union marked a turning point for NATO. With the Cold War over, the alliance has adapted to a transformed geopolitical landscape featuring terrorism, hybrid threats, China's challenges to the international system, and the advance of authoritarianism around the globe. NATO's membership has grown significantly since its inception. The alliance now includes 32 countries, including the most recent additions, Finland and Sweden. The alliance also maintains partnerships with countries ranging from Ukraine in Europe to Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea in the Indo-Pacific, to nations across the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Today, as they did when NATO and the Atlantic Council were born, the United States and its allies confront an inflection point in history, just as NATO has expanded its mission and ambition to meet the demands of an ever-changing world. So too has the Atlantic Council. It is in challenging times like these that the global future is shaped. This is our moment to shape that future together.
Please join me in a very warm welcome for Jenna Ben-Yehuda, Executive Director of the Atlantic Council.
Well, thank you so much. If I had known there was pizza, I would have said yes much earlier. Well, thank you so much, first and foremost, Ambassador Stevenson, for the warm welcome and your kind words. I've had the great fortune of working with a number of American ambassadors throughout my career. Ambassador Stevenson is just a a gem, a wonderful person, deeply accomplished, and I think you've also seen in your own experience working with her, somebody who really cares about you as a person, which is so critically important for our diplomacy and for your own development. So thank you, Ambassador Stevenson, for that welcome and for hosting me here. It's great to be here with all of you. I wanted to share at the beginning this video that we produced as part of the NATO summit to give you some of the story of how the council came together and which has informed my work and the worldview and how we engage. So the council is a nonpartisan organization that galvanizes U.S. leadership and engagement in the world in partnership with allies and its partners to shape solutions to global challenges. So we don't do it alone. Driven by our mission of shaping the global future together, we promote constructive leadership on the international stage and provide an essential forum to navigate the economic, political, and security challenges that really have come to define the 21st century. And so we bring together folks from all over the world to shape the conversation through convening power. We host 900 events a year, bringing together officials, thought leaders from across the world to discuss the most pressing challenges on the international stage. We also influence the field by publishing cutting-edge research, reports, and short-form pieces. The council has 16 programs and centers that I lead that cover a series of regional and functional issues ranging from U.S. relations and Africa to harnessing the power of emerging and disruptive technologies. We're truly a global organization. I can tell you that from the smells in the cafeteria around lunchtime. Not always a good thing. But if there is a major political issue, a geopolitical issue that is happening in the world that you're interested in, chances are you can find it at the Atlantic Council. Somebody smart is working on it. But for today's conversation, I really want to focus on the defining issue at the heart of the Council's creation, which remains central to our ongoing mission today, and that's transatlantic security. And really how the United States works with our European allies to promote a shared set of values and interests. So the Council, as you saw briefly, was founded in '61 by former Secretaries of State Dean Acheson and Christian Herter. They served in that capacity during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, one Democrat, one Republican, in the early years of the Cold War, as the collective West came together to configure a new post-war international order. So one of the institutions set up during this period and signed into existence by Secretary Acheson in 1949 was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Secretary Acheson was just 21 when the First World War broke out. How many of you are 21 in this room? I mean, think about it. Think about what it meant for Acheson to be your age at that moment in history, because you're living history now. And so his generation came at age of a time when old uncertainties of 19th century imperial power collapsed. Sounding familiar? They experienced the horrors of the First World War and saw how efforts to create a post-war order by punishing the defeated party gave rise to extremist ideologies. Fascism, communism, World War II, and the Holocaust. Their generation had absorbed the lessons of previous failures. And with the new threats posed by the Soviet Union, they determined that the best way to avoid history from repeating itself required a greater transatlantic community to really bind together through a web of shared institutions designed to promote our common liberty, prosperity, and security. So NATO was their answer to this question of collective security. And in April of 1949, 12 countries, many of whom had twice been enemies in their own living memory, came together to agree that an attack on any one of them constituted an attack on all of them. And it was through this reinforcing sense of trust and obligation, of shared values and shared interests, that NATO would become the most successful and durable political military alliance in history. And in the 75 years that followed, the alliance prevailed for the most part in the Cold War, welcoming 20 additional allies and ushered in a decades-long peace dividend in Europe that allowed the continent to rebuild from the ruins of World War II into the strongest bloc today. And of course, I would also humbly suggest that these visionaries also created the Atlantic Council to act as a powerful, nonpartisan champion of a world order that advances personal freedom, democracy, peace, and security to strengthen alliances that serve as force multipliers in this endeavor, because states alone, treaties alone, do not a commitment make. And this continues to be the guiding purpose of the Council today. So it goes without saying that a lot has changed in the world since the Council was founded, and it's changed not just since the end of the Cold War or since 9/11 or even since COVID. Many of the conclusions that we took from winning the Cold War, that we were in this post-history age where democracy would spread irresistibly around the world, has been dashed. And far from integrating into Western institutions, Vladimir Putin's Russia harbors revanchist ambitions to relitigate the end of the Cold War and to reconstitute the Soviet Empire at Europe's expense. And he's doing so with no thought to the human cost that he's inflicting. His appalling crimes against the Ukrainian people recall some of the darkest days of the 21st century. But beyond Ukraine, Putin continues to target NATO allies through a campaign of hybrid or so-called gray zone warfare tactics, because these are acts that are just shy of traditional kinetic warfare. These include cyber attacks, assassination plots, and attacks on critical infrastructure, such as severing undersea cables. Commercial flights in Finland have been grounded because of the echoes of GPS scrambling that can imperil safe air travel. And this quiet war of Russian attacks against a host of NATO countries exists alongside Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, and it has helped it to endure because it attrits that capability and exacts a cost on countries that is borne broadly across their societies. So that too is happening in the background. That's because Vladimir Putin's war is not just against Ukraine, it's against everyone who believes in a world in which sovereign states are free to determine their own paths. The horrific cost of war in Ukraine is more visible, but we must remember that this isn't an assault against just one nation or even many across NATO. It's an assault on principles of sovereignty, on democracy and the rule of law, and the right of citizens to self-determination, and the ideals that underpin the world order that has delivered security to the US and our allies for decades. So we must remain steadfast in our rejection of this worldview. But just as we can appreciate the singular value of this alliance and the peace dividend it's delivered, we have to acknowledge that it remains imperfect. And so we're charged with insisting upon an alliance that remains purpose-built for the times in which we live and the evolving nature of the threats we face. So we can't forget that the one time in NATO's 75-year history that the alliance has invoked Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on all, was following the September 11th attacks on the United States. So for all of the Sturm und Drang, this turmoil about NATO's relative value, we can't forget that it's delivered in ways indirectly and rather pointedly to shore up US defenses. In so many respects, NATO has functioned as an iron dome of sorts for the United States, offering a missile defense shield protecting the US from conflict in Europe and bringing a phalanx of supporters to our aid. But like the US, NATO has also miscalculated. That same support for the US pushed NATO into decades of out-of-area campaigns, combat and stabilization alike, as NATO joined US efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan in a variety of ways, and incurred tremendous cost and many casualties in doing so. And as we look at the on-continent threat that NATO faces in Russia with a return to a land war in Europe, it's tempting to question whether things might have been different if NATO had remained focused on Europe. But those are answers that are lost to history. We, the US and NATO, held post-Cold War hopes that relative prosperity would also bring about democracy in China. But I think we see now that that outcome has been quite different. Instead, through unfair trade practices and economic coercion abroad and political and civil repression at home, the Chinese Communist Party has consolidated wealth and power, which it's now using to undermine the very institutional order that in many respects helped to pull the Chinese people out of poverty and integrate into the global economic system. And while NATO's territory might be physically far removed from China, NATO members recognize that the threats China poses to transatlantic security and prosperity are very real. And this was most clearly manifested in the material and diplomatic support that the PRC is providing to Russia, enabling Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. That's why last summer's summit in Washington was noteworthy, because it was there that we saw the emergence of clear language from NATO about the nature of the Chinese threat in the summit's communique. I quote, "This increases, China, the threat Russia poses to its neighbors and to Euro-Atlantic security. We call on the PRC as a permanent member of the UN Security Council with a particular responsibility to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter to cease all material and political support to Russia's war effort. The PRC cannot enable the largest war in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting its interests and reputation," end quote. That's clear language, and it's language that was achieved through consensus, meaning all 32 nations agree to it. And it's why NATO's partners in the Indo-Pacific, the so-called IP4, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, have participated in recent NATO summits and information sharing efforts. But unlike NATO's out-of-area forays into the Middle East, its focus on China really is about direct threats to NATO nations. And while NATO members have now reached consensus about the threat that China poses to the alliance, many of their economies at the same time remain rather beholden to Chinese technologies, many signs that de-risking from China in an economic sense is becoming an important and interrelated aspect of defanging its security posture in Europe. But China isn't the only threat facing NATO. The collective cooperation of nations who don't share our values multiplies that threat. Russia and China are joined in this axis of aggressors by Iran and North Korea, two states that are determined to sow chaos and undermine global power and stability. Our adversaries are growing bolder. North Korean troops are joining their Russian counterparts in the war against Ukraine. That was not on my bingo card for last year. And while Beijing and Tehran are increasingly providing Moscow with the material and technology necessary to sustain a war of attrition, that is all happening in this swirl of cooperation. Meanwhile, other nations like India have been critical to Russia's ability to sustain its wartime effort through the dramatic purchases of cheap Russian oil, even as that nation seeks to deepen its relationship with the United States. The growing cooperation amongst all of these actors allows Russia to circumvent Western sanctions and grow its wartime economy. In so doing, they're also undermining international stability and increasing the risks of unleashing war on a global scale. We've also seen an expression of interest from the Chinese in providing peacekeepers in Ukraine. That is, if it can reconcile its economic interests, which hinge on access to cheap Russian oil. So what concessions might China exact for bearing that responsibility? And if not China, who? And what does the energy landscape look like in Ukraine if its ability to receive continued military aid from the United States requires it to forfeit rights to critical minerals, the subject of current negotiations right now? So, like the eras that followed the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War, in 2025, we stand at another inflection point in history. And it's at times like these pivotal moments, that new administrations are also taking office on both sides of the Atlantic. Heard a lot of anxiety expressed about the future of transatlantic relations and a concern that leaders in Washington and Europe have incompatible approaches to international diplomacy. Without a doubt, this is a moment that requires careful but purposeful action. And after a generation of underspending and in some instances neglect, European countries unquestionably need to spend more on their own defense. And the good news is that many are taking this step. In addition to providing considerable support, Europe has and continues to provide to Ukraine. And out of the 32 NATO countries and allies, 23 now meet the 2% target, up from just 6 countries in 2021. though it's also now clear that 3% is the new 2%, given the requirements of the current raft of NATO plans. So just when you thought you were catching up, the dynamics have shifted. Just this week, the leaders of France and the UK were both in Washington to discuss with President Trump the future of European security, including Ukraine. That comes after a small summit of leaders with Macron in Paris. We are living history. As for President Trump, this moment presents him with a chance to cement his place in history as a leader of genuine consequence. But as my colleague and my boss, Atlantic Council President and CEO Fred Kemp, articulated in a recent article, there's no world in which a weaker, more fragmented transatlantic community preoccupied with infighting is in the interest of either the United States or Europe. On the contrary, no relationship is more foundational to shaping the global future. So to the students here, welcome to a career in foreign affairs. It's a messy, complex, interconnected world we've curated just for you. Sorry. It's probably not the world that many of you thought you would enter as you prepare to leave this campus and make your way in the world. And that can be really daunting. But you're also living in a moment of change and disruption, and you can help shape it. And we need your fresh perspectives and insights because the grown-ups do not have a lock on international peace and security. And this future, it's your future. So strap on your life vests and come on in and help us navigate these treacherous waters, because I do think our ship is sturdy, but the winds are really high and the water is really choppy, and we need a lot of help rigging your sails. Thank you.
Well, those were terrific remarks. Thank you so much, Jenna. We've only got a few minutes. I'm going to skip to the second question and go straight to the elephant in the room, which is the Munich Security Conference.
Yes.
And just to ask, what is your take on how the Europeans are responding to Vice President J.D. Vance's speech?
Well, I think so. Ambassador Stevenson is referring to the gathering of leaders, this Transatlantic conference, the Munich Security Conference that happens every February and conveniently over Valentine's Day weekend, much to the chagrin of Americans everywhere. And we all descend into snowy Munich, and it was there that the Vice President offered really strong words for what European leaders might expect from U.S. cooperation in this administration moving forward. I think the response, the short answer is it depends. It depends who you talk to. I think you could read that 17-minute address and come away pretty nervous as a European. But if you dig a little bit deeper and you look to some of the Nordic-Baltic responses, for example, if you look to Finnish President Stubb, this is what a lot of Northern European partners have been asking for a really long time. We were talking earlier about Foreign Minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski's entreaty to European partners to step it up for a long time as Poland hits, 5% of its GDP on defense. And it's something that had been a feature of the Biden administration for many years. And as you heard in my remarks, President Biden was successful in bringing so many more countries into that. And yet there's so much more work that needs to be done. Now, I think the question remains, how do we get there and what does it look like for these nations to come together? But it's clear, that there's a split. A lot of that is dependent on geography. Borders can sharpen the mind and a proximity to Russia can help one focus. And so I don't think it's lost on these Nordic Baltic states, which have long been spending disproportionate shares of their economy to do that this is really called for. I think the question becomes, how do folks step up and what other China gets broken in the process?
I love that differentiation because we can sort of assume it's a monolithic block, but it's anything but that. At the NATO Summit Public Forum, one of the things that was really, I took away from that was listening to heads of state from NATO talking about this hybrid warfare, this gray zone warfare that you described. And I wanted you to talk about it a little bit more, Jenna. What does it look like? And then, are we doing a good job countering it?
Yeah. So it can look like a lot of different things, but gray zone warfare is traditionally those tactics which fall just short of what we think of as traditional kinetic warfare. So it might look like an assassination plot. It might look like some of the GPS scrambling that I talked about. It could look like challenges to ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure, especially in the energy sector. Why do it? Well, it attrits capability, as I noted. It exacts a tremendous cost. It's relatively cheap for nations to do, or for non-state actors to do. We see the Houthis doing this to great effect on their own. And the US has been embarrassingly limited in its ability to counter some of this. We talked about the F-35s trying to shoot down, drones that you could buy for 50K or 100K. So there's an asymmetry that exists which exploits the nature of conventional weaponry. So it can be faster to do, it can be relatively cheap to do, and then attribution can, though not always, be difficult to discern. What do I mean by attribution? Who done it? Where's it coming from? And because some of that is not always clear, it can be hard to respond and hard to think about the proportional response that is appropriate under the circumstances. It also comes to private industry in a way that private sector companies just are starting to factor this in to the price of doing business. So they'll pay the ransomware to move on and keep the grid up and moving and running, but it's clearly exacting a cost. So I think what needs to happen, and we're seeing a broader acknowledgement of this in NATO, and exercises are beginning to coordinate and incorporate some of this and operationalize thinking around gray zone warfare. There has to be more cooperation with the private sector. There has to be education around like a see something, say something, report this in so that the story can be told about the collective cost to societies, because it is really tremendous and it is kind of a silent killer that's out there. I talk to Romanian colleagues all the time. They're getting massive attacks on their healthcare system, and it's taking away their assets and response capabilities in other parts of the country which are providing supports to Ukraine, right? So all of this is connected and has been happening to great effect. And it is also a clarion call for agility in the way that we respond given the nature of our dynamic threat environment.
Do you put disinformation as part and parcel of gray zone warfare, or do you put it in a category of its own?
That's interesting. I think of kind of online harm, if you will. This pollution of the information environment absolutely creates conditions that are fertile for these attacks to happen, and also sway, political communities, movements, societally, that can help ensure that, on the one hand, attacks like these are never heard, you don't hear about them. Right. So the cost is still there, but the impact is not known. And it can also change the attribution nature. So I think it definitely clouds the picture, which is part of the intent.
So I'm going to come back to agility here, but I want to call out our Center for European Studies, which is just a jewel in the crown of our great 6 national resource centers here at UNC. The Center for European Studies on Friday and Saturday hosts our first ever Model EU here at UNC, and then I think they're going to talk to you about hosting Model NATO in the fall. So in those, one of the things I talked about Friday night was that part of the diplomacy initiative is to give you a chance to practice listening in the search for common ground, because in these consensus organizations like the EU and NATO, you have to make a consensus, hear each other in order to get anything done. But now we're facing a threat which requires agility, and we had a great little conversation in the green room about the challenges and possible really downsides of consensus-based organizations like NATO. So I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, listen, my husband and I have 3 teenagers, and if 2 out of 3 of them like what's for dinner, it stays on the menu. That's a Ben-Yehuda A, and then the enchiladas will be back. So, thinking about achieving consensus on matters of security across 32 nations is a tall order.
Yes.
It's a tall order. If you think about what is required in the difference of whether you're the United States or you're Romania or you're Finland or you're Spain or Italy. It's really incredible that as much is able to get accomplished. At the same time, it's not built for speed. And so in a moment like this, when we have cheap, relatively accessible technologies that make it really easy to inflict damage, when our global energy markets are so deeply tied into these security questions, when the quest for critical minerals are key determinants in the nature of ceasefire negotiations, it becomes a pretty challenging moment to think about how a large consensus-driven organization can meet a moment like that. And that, I think, is part of the challenge that multilateral organizations broadly are facing in this moment. This is a post-World War II architecture, largely speaking, designed for an era in which women had to ask their husbands for permission for credit cards, and there was no internet, and there was no email, and I mean, it was a totally different universe. And yet, we're using those same structures to address this current environment. So there is an asymmetry and an advantage where certainly authoritarians have a huge advantage. Organized crime has a huge advantage. Any network-directed, agile framework has an advantage over hierarchies, especially those that are consensus-driven. So there is tremendous power and unity and thrust behind when that agreement can be achieved, but there is also cost. And sometimes that cost cannot be borne in a durable fashion because we don't have the time. Look at all of the GDP combined of the nations of NATO and think about the threat that Russia imposes in Ukraine. And then think about what it meant to deliver the military aid that was delivered and how much time it took to get there. I would argue it was too little, too late. And so we have to think about how we preserve institutions, but also how we help them reform so that we can continue to enjoy the benefits of the consensus and the support that that engenders, but also harness some level of dynamism and agility so that we don't continue to confront an asymmetry in the threat environment. It's really hard.
It's really hard. Thank you so much for that. We've reached your favorite part, the question and answer thing. I'm going to give you raise your hand if you think you have a question. Good. Happy to see some hands up. Mics on both sides, so go ahead and make your way to the mics, and when you come, I'm going to ask you to please identify yourself, tell us what year you're in and what you're studying, and I am betting we're going to get some questions that are going to eclipse mine here, which is really such a pivotal moment for Ukraine, but I'd be so surprised if our students who've been really showing up for the events about Ukraine aren't going to ask you better questions than I could have. Let's start on this side. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Lily. I'm a freshman, and I'm wanting to study environmental policy. I'm currently majoring in public policy and then geography and the environment. And I had a question for you. I was wondering, in your work with the Truman National Security Project in the Atlantic Council, how have you seen environmental issues intersect with national security decisions?
Thanks, Lily, for that question. I mean, climate change is real. It's happening. It's now. And it is generating impacts in lots of different ways. We live in a moment where we have more complex, simultaneous humanitarian crises than at any point in modern memory. So if we think about those that have been displaced as a result of food insecurity, as a result of crops that no longer are able to thrive. Not all of this displacement, much of it, but not all of this displacement is coming at the hands of political repression. A lot of it is economically motivated because there is not access to employment because of some of the dynamics wrought by climate change. That produces tremendous levels of migration, which is forcing a lot of these conversations of populism and move to authoritarianism and pressure within Europe and other places. So we see the nature of climate having really destabilizing impacts on our geopolitics, certainly. I think there are huge questions also about the nature of our security. Our own American bases are not necessarily ready for climate change. Even in the Carolinas, we think about the nature of snow, how often here? What does that mean? Think about what 2 inches of snow did to this campus. Well, think about on the other end of the spectrum, what extreme heat is doing in places around the world with tanks that have, treads that are melting and, unable to run, the fuel requirements, its expense. You've got a lot of Norfolk thinking about what it's going to be like with sea level rise and those installations underwater. So there are really very real operational impacts to the nature of our military basing just within the United States domestically alone in CONUS in the continental United States. And those are major consequences. We think about the changing nature of what it means in the United States to make the argument for the need for foreign aid at a time when California is on fire. When there's no fire season, it's an all the time threat that happens at a moment's notice, sometimes with no notice, devastating flooding like we've seen in Asheville and outlying areas in the Carolinas. This is so clearly having devastating impacts on nations that sometimes, frequently, and really encourage, there's a demand signal to turn inward, right? And so I really worry about unmet need. I worry about the destabilizing broad societal impacts, and then there's an operational level. The list goes on, but the intersections are so clear, and so it's an important field of study. I think you'll have no shortage of problems to solve.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. Please.
Hello, my name is Austin Hicks. I'm a senior studying political science and history, and I'm also a union organizer. My question, in your talk, you spoke about the challenges that the People's Republic of China poses to national self-determination around the world. American historian David Michael Smith has tallied the total cost of human life between U.S. military interventions, coups, wars, and invasions since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 to be 25 million people spread across 24 different countries that we've invaded, couped, or overthrown. And most recently in Bolivia in 2019. In your estimate, which country is the greatest threat to the national self-determination of countries around the world between China, who hasn't fought a war in 40 years, and the United States, who's engaged in this mass death?
Austin, thanks for the question. I think that there's a lot of hurt, and engagement is not uniformly a source of good. I have a 17-year-old daughter who reminded me that for most of her life, she grew up with a country at war in Afghanistan. And the U.S. that I came of age in was a U.S. in which, the Berlin Wall was falling and there was access to greater freedoms. I think the role of all of students here and for policymakers alike is to really think about what are the stakes and where are the outcomes that can be achieved. I won't say for a moment that anybody is blameless. No one is blameless. There have been big mistakes that happen all the time. I think what's important to really consider is what is the environment in which we're operating and where is the opportunity for change. I would offer that the premise of your question, I don't know that there's an answer to that. I think it matters for whom and when. I think, I've endeavored to dedicate my own work to efforts to expand conversation and engagement, for outreach, for a focus on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. It's hard work. And it's work that we're still kind of just learning how to do. And a lot of mistakes happen all the time. I spent the first 20 years of my career focused on Latin America. So a lot of the examples that you cited are, I've been to the exhumation of mass graves in Guatemala. I've stood with family members who are there for, information about the dental records of family members they lost years and years ago. There is a tremendous toll of human suffering that is born out of conflict. And we have moments in our history when that suffering looks different. The threat that China poses, I would argue, is an element of that suffering. I don't think we need to have a suffering or harm Olympiad. There's a lot to go around, and I think it can be different and measured in a range of ways in how you experience it. But I would offer that the surveillance, the nature of the surveillance state, the restriction of speech and access, the inability to get on a clean and open internet for a nation of over 1 billion people is something that should really concern us. And so I don't think that oftentimes there's a binary that exists in these moments. It's much more of a yes and dynamic. And there's a lot that calls our attention.
Great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, my name is Jacob Doklo. I'm a freshman studying political science and European studies. I wanted to reiterate a question that is no doubt constantly on the mind of our European counterparts. How do you see the evolving security landscape in Europe shaping the future of NATO's transatlantic partnership, particularly in light of differing US and EU strategic priorities? And what steps should be taken to ensure burden sharing within the alliance?
Thanks, Jacob. I think it's pretty clear that there's a strong demand signal for the United States for Europe to step up and take a much stronger hand in its own defense. I was in Norway in May for the first time, and it really took more beer than it should have for me to get a Norwegian general to admit to me that the way that their new 12-year, much lauded defense commitment of 3% spending was going to be achieved. There was so much celebration around, wow, 3%, 12 years of funding, big stuff. And I kept saying, so how'd you pay for it? I knew how to pay. How'd you pay for it? Where did it come from? So amazing that you were able to muster all of these resources. How did you do it? I love playing dumb on these kinds of things. And he finally conceded, this was like interest payment. These were interest earnings off of sovereign wealth funds from energy deposits. It had been there all along. This was never brought to the Norwegian people. There was no referendum on, are you no longer going to get 16 months or however much it is of parental leave, and instead we're going to spend. Those were not the trade-offs. There were not trade-offs, which I do think begs the question, you could have been doing this all along. Why not? Why not? And so I think we have folks' attention. Now, it's going to be easier for a Norway to step up than it's going to be for many other countries. A lot of Europe right now has flat to levels of growth. Not a lot to write home about. And if you consider the ability to increase those, we were just talking today about the UK and Stormer coming in and saying 2.5%, but guess what they're doing? They're cutting DFID, they're cutting foreign aid. So for a number of countries, most countries, it's not going to be the cream off the top of a sovereign wealth fund. That money is going to have to come from somewhere. And so at a time when I think we need more assistance and not less, we have to ask, what are the second and third order effects going to be from that? I think that's an important question. And one of the great things for those of you who care about these issues to study would be to start tracking that. Who is stepping up to the plate? What do the numbers look like? And how are they paying for it? Because that's going to be an important story that comes out of this moment. I don't think we have the answers yet, but it's going to be pretty interesting and complicated to find out.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to go to you in just a sec, but I want to share the reflection of our speaker from Friday night about the potential ramifications of this, speaking from kind of a French point of view, which is that we'll have to spend more on defense. And then when we do, it will mean less money for education and healthcare and transportation. And as those get squeezed, it may very well encourage the discontent that leads to the rise of right and causes voters to vote for the right. And the reflection on what some of those trade-offs would be were kind of sobering. Katie and I were there together. And these are hard trade-offs. I've watched us spend about half of the world's defense spending, certainly more than the next 9 nations combined, and sometimes wondered why we didn't do more for, the child tax credit, universal head start for 3 and 4-year-olds. There are trade-offs, and we've made a different set than Europe has. And
Absolutely. As somebody who's never had paid parental leave and has 3 children, I'll be the first to say that there are huge costs. That's a topic for a different day, but yeah, the money's going to have to come from somewhere. But I don't think it's necessarily true that it will yield those kinds of impacts. We have a say in what that looks like. Europeans have a say in the future of their own economies and their nations in that respect. And it also means that we're going to have to spend smarter. It doesn't mean everybody needs the same toys. We got to figure out, like, what are you bringing to this defense potluck? Like, do you have air power? Do we trust that you're going to show up with your air power? Is it good enough air power? Does it work with our sea power? Because we're really good on sea power. We do littoral, you don't, we'll do littoral. Like, who's bringing the lasagna? Who's bringing the salad? Otherwise, we're all ending up with breadsticks. So there has to be some consideration about how we spend smarter. I think it's lazy thinking just to suggest that you need more. It can't be. It's not going to add up.
hey, who's next?
Hi, my name's Griffin. I'm a senior studying international relations. I actually go to NC State, so I appreciate you'll have some red on it today. So yeah, over the last month, we've seen the Trump administration kind of switch our entire approach to the global institutional framework away from a cooperative approach to a more coercive approach. How do you see the coercive approach kind of playing out within the NATO framework and I guess other international institutions over the next 4 years?
Yeah. Look, you're asking me to take out a crystal ball, and I wish I had one. I can tell you that we have the attention of a lot of European partners, and there have been near-term commitments to increase defense spending. Will there be a cost to doing that? Probably. Will some other things be harmed in the process? Possibly. I don't think we know yet. But I do think that while certainly the tactics and the tone of the nature of these interventions is different from a previous administration, there's an intentionality there that is not necessarily divorced from where we've been. There has been a call for increased U.S. partner defense spending for a really long time. It just hasn't been particularly effective. So what else gets broken in the process, I think, is something to watch for. But it's not to say that there aren't elements here that have some truth to them. I think there is a reason why it's being done. There's support for it. And people will concede that does serve aims that have been shared by both U.S. parties. Now, what outcomes it delivers is another question. I think if we have a situation in which the U.S. is able to help Ukraine reach a ceasefire with Russia in a way that does allow for some kind of security guarantees for Ukraine, and in the process, the U.S. has access to stores of critical minerals, that could be a very good outcome. That's not yet the outcome. We don't know if that's the outcome. So I think the question is, what's going to shake this loose? Because right now there's a tremendous amount of rhetoric. There is some disconcerting speech. There are seeming reversals across a range of things. I mean, the votes in the UN alone, I think, are, pretty astonishing for those of us who've watched this stuff for a long time. I was also joking in the green room that there was I think it was an Onion article years ago where somebody said, I really wanted real power, so I left the United Nations and became a Little League coach. Ouch. I mean, the enforceability of some of these things, and this gets back to the nature and the sclerotic element of these institutions, is undeniable. So what is going to shake this loose and create these outcomes? I think it's early days, but there is a possibility, and I think there's a vested interest on the part of this White House to achieve a victory there. So, watch this space.
Play is still wet.
That's right.
Please.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Alice. I'm a junior, and I'm in a double program of Human Organizational Leadership Development and European Contemporary Studies. I have a kind of a follow-up question to the previous one. Given the evolving geopolitical landscape, how crucial, in your opinion, is a multidisciplinary approach in strengthening the Transatlantic Alliance? So from your perspective, what are really the most underutilized fields that could contribute to a stronger policymaking between the U.S. and its European allies?
Thanks, Alice. Your studies sound really interesting. Look, I am partial to UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. It's worth reading. And it really affirms the value of having women involved in the peace process. And we know from the data that peace conversations that include women are more durable and longer lasting and achieve greater peace than those that exclude them. I mean, imagine 51, 52% of the population being included in a peace process might help things along. But it's true, it does, and the data is there to support it. So the women, peace, and security conversation is part of the multidisciplinary approach that is required in a moment of peace building. So I think that's one avenue to consider. I also think we really need to consider the economic implications and dynamics that are afoot right now. I don't know if there are econ requirements in the Global Studies program. If there aren't, take some econ, because this is where people are making decisions. People are voting with their pocketbooks here just as they are everywhere else. And you understanding the interplay of economic systems and inequality and mechanisms for prosperity and access to formal sector economy and human development and growth trajectories, that is going to determine whether folks can stay at home or they need to leave their country to find work elsewhere. It's going to be determinant about how expensive it is for nations to borrow money and free themselves from the traps of debt. So, I think we have a lot of work to do to bring economic statecraft into the level of coordination and a part of the conversation that really the moment requires. But that's something certainly as students that you can equip yourselves with because the money talks, it always does.
Thank you so much.
Here. So we have reached 6:30, and we're very, very good about cutting it off when we reach 6:30, but the conversation is going to continue in the atrium. So I'm just going to ask if people will just do me the favor of not crowding around Jenna while I get her out the door. She'll come out, grab yourself some pizza, and come and sit and join around. So the first dibs go to you that are lined up to have a question, and then so give us a chance to get out without talking. But beyond that, I just want to say thank you to Jenna for a really a great presentation, and thank you for joining me.